Hey everyone, Mark here from Citizen Sketcher. Here's a painting I recorded for you guys. We're going to do a sketch of Charles Darwin, done from a black and white historical photo found on the web. For this demo, I'm going to be building up the features in 3 or 4 passes, working from larger to smaller and lighter to darker. I want to show you the advantages of layering passages of wet on dry watercolor, how to accumulate a depth of color, and how to control the wet and dry edge. This is fundamental to how I paint, using the edges of washes to become the drawing. As long as this shape is wet, you can get these soft transitions. Each passage has to be a logically complete shape. So when you start a new shape, then you can stitch it into the previous one by connecting wet to wet edges. They'll fuse together naturally if you work one shape into the next. I don't want to jump around, leave any unconsidered edges. How they're going to connect is part of the plan. I'm carefully observing what's shadow, my colored shape, and what's light, my reserved white paper, the dry area. I don't want to lose those nice white glints. That sort of is the drawing. A painting doesn't have line work, like an ink drawing, but it does have these light and dark edges. I like to say, you paint with the inside, you draw with the outside. That is, I want color variation and blending, painting going on inside these wet shapes. But I want the hard edge to define the structural forms, the eyelids, the pupils, all of the description of what's going on. So maybe you can see already how a color that might seem too dark initially starts to normalize as you blend it out, when you're spreading the pigment. As well, a very wet paint will continue to get lighter as it dries. So that brings us to the second pass. The first wet shape is dried down into a very pale underdrawing. Still has some color gradients, but it's quite subtle. So I need to go back in and deepen values. So it's important to reiterate, I've allowed the first pass to dry completely. I'll often use a hairdryer. So I'm totally free to pull edges again, to charge in again, use all the properties of the wet on dry edge control. So each successive passage gets darker as the layers combine. And with each layer you're reserving whites, but not just white, it's the underdrawing showing through. As I continue, I'm starting to make smaller and smaller changes. Each time you do a new layer, you're just adjusting what went before, so the painting should progress from the largest shapes to tiny little adjustments. Gradually, as I build up these midtones, I'm adding texture to the beard, rounding out the form. More than half of his face is hair, so the drawing here is very important. I want to imply volume, bushiness in the beard. Just reflect as well the anatomy of what's going on underneath. It might seem painstaking going over your work more than once, but in real life this has probably only been about 20 or 30 minutes of painting. It can go quite quickly when you're in a rhythm, as long as it's not too humid, in which case you might have to wait for things to dry. Or use the hairdryer. There's that too. Here's some nice little blends. Even in a spot this small, I'm thinking about colored gradients. This is still the second pass here. I'm just going to create a shadow to refine the hairline and make that flat depression on a person's temple. And then I'll smooth out the dome of his skull. So it's interesting how these 2 layers of transparency, the color here is very washy, very thin. But these 2 transparencies are going to work together to make this smoother shape. Here I'm adding some transitional darks where the beard meets the collar and the background. And this part is fun. Using the skin tone to shave back the beard. This is an all or nothing thing. Once you cut the dark over the light, there's no going back. Okay, third time's the charm. I'm returning again to build up the final dark value. I'm really making small improvements. This last stage will be tiny changes, concentrating on the features. It only takes a little more depth, a little richer paint, less water, more pigment, to achieve a dark that'll stay dark. It won't lighten as much as the washes do. This richer paint mix is a bit like making a pen and ink drawing. Except you can blend it. See how that nose to cheek area just pops out? Wonderful. That's exactly what I'm looking for. That contrast edge between light and dark. I'm trying to paint wrinkles in the forehead here, and it's not working. The paper is too wet or the paint is too thin or both. As I try to make lines, it just fades into the wash. Here's a titanium white tint that's called Gray of Gray from Holbein Watercolors. I find it very useful to have a near white opaque pigment that's still a watercolor, so it still blends with water and I can do my edge pulling. When it's used full strength, it has a lot of coverage. You could use gouache for this, but I like this watercolor. So I'm almost done here, but I see I want to push down the shadow on his shoulder a little further. And I'm at a stage where you really could call it finished, but I can't resist these last minute tweaks, little tiny darks to emphasize form. The forehead is drier, so I can go back and try those wrinkles again. These are little small changes. The accumulation makes a huge difference to his expression. I just want to make him a little bit more melancholy, add some gravitas. Darwin was, after all, proposing huge changes to society. He must have been under a bit of pressure. I suppose you could say I'm doing a fourth pass on these eyes. Let's call it 3.5. They just need a tiny bit more depth. Just a feeling of the undersides, the eyelids, and the depth of the eye sockets. This is always a risky phase of the process, convincing yourself to stop. Really, you could keep going endlessly, and it's very hard to define that point where something feels overworked. So there's one very final step. I just feel I have to push back the dark background with a big wet wash. So I actually went in and pre-wet with clear water to achieve that. So there we have it. It's the final painting, scanned for a little better color fidelity. So you've seen how by working in layers of larger to smaller shapes and working lighter to darker, we can take full advantage of wet on dry blending in watercolor. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.